It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us with, I see, what do you got there? A tablet?
iPad Pro, iPhone,
right,
usual
Christopher
stuff.
Dickey 2.0 is with us today. Also with us, Aznavour Pedro, Paris correspondent for Portuguese weekly Visão.
Yes.
Nice to see you.
I see you in no paper, no nothing.
All right. She's graced us with her presence from the second floor. Angela Diffley, reporter for Sister Station, Radio France International's English language service.
Hi, I have paper.
You have paper and pen, okay. Old school. Patrick Smith, the editor-in-chief of the Africa Report.
Extremely old school.
All right, is with us as well. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. Gosh, what a busy week. Elections, inquiries, spy scandals. And here in France, a national tribute. Charles Aznavour, who were the paid tribute there, being paid tribute to at Les Invalides. On the way out, they played Emmenez-moi, one of his hits, as his coffin was taken for his funeral in the Paris suburbs, dubbed by some the French Sinatra, the singer-songwriter whose big break came when Edith Piaf took him on tour, passed away Monday at the age of 94. His send-off drawing two presidents, that of the Armenia of his origins and that of France.
Cette présence, cette voix,
that presence, that voice, that intonation that stood out from the rest, came into our lives and brought us together, regardless of circumstance or age.
quel que soit notre âge.
A communal sensation was created,
Commune s'est créée,
and Charles Aznavour became naturally,
naturellement,
unanimously, one of the faces of France.
un des visages de la France.
Now, this national send-off taking place in this very staid and grandiose atmosphere. Les Invalides is where Napoleon is buried. Aznavour Pedro, your thoughts?
If he was 20 today and he wanted to come to France, to immigrate to France, do you think he would be allowed to? Would France have the grand Charles Aznavour, the French Frank Sinatra, in, I don't know, 70 years from now?
Well,
Probably
in fairness to the president, Macron, in his homage, paying tribute to the fact that he was somebody who came from this multicultural background.
Yes, and still very difficult today to go across borders in Europe if you are not from inside European Union. But also, just one thing, in the 50s, he met Edith Piaf, the big voice, La Vie en Rose, and he followed her to the United States. He didn't have a dime on his pocket. On arrival, he didn't have a visa. He went to jail for 3 days. He was let out by a judge that thought, well, this foreigner, it's not going to do any harm to us. He survived in New York playing poker, cheating on poker, meeting Edith Piaf, and struggling to get to the top of the, of the pile. So,
yeah, it's a wonderful story of a refugee who embraced his host country and enriched it fantastically. And unlike, the other great that we mourned last year, Johnny Hallyday, he's so much better known outside France. He's enormously well known, Charles Aznavour. I can remember, I think he was the person who probably drew me towards the French language, like very, very many other people. And Macron today said something very good when he said that if you begin the first line of many of Aznavour's songs, most people in France can finish that first line. They're incredibly well known. And he just seemed to be an extremely good guy, really. His guiding value seems to have been love, all kinds of love for mothers, in a time when it wasn't fashionable at all, the song about the gay guy where he...
In the 1960s.
Absolutely, and he totally empathised with a loneliness of a man, and that was way ahead of its time. And I think there's little and few people saying very much bad about him. The songs are lovely. And the words are magnificent.
And the tale of his life, again, we begin in the 1950s. Of course, 1988, when there's the terrible earthquake in Armenia, which is then Soviet Armenia still.
Barely, yeah.
He espouses that cause and raises the banner of Armenia.
Well, of course he did, and we have to remember there is a very big and a very significant Armenian community here in France. It's one of the biggest in the world, and he represented that community, and we've heard a lot about that in the last couple of days since his death. But what's really interesting is, to me, you're constantly hearing that there's no such thing as a hyphenated Frenchman, that there's no such thing as a dual nationality here. Of course, there are dual nationalities, but everybody's describing him as both Armenian and French, which by some lights would be anti-Republican. But I think Anna's putting her finger on it. The whole attitude toward Aznavour stands in such tremendous contrast to the attitude toward immigrants and refugees that we see today.
Patrick Smith?
Well, he did sing, I think, in 6 different languages. And I think it says something about this issue of not just being an immigrant, but actually coming back to the world and projecting much more global image of the country. I mean, that's certainly why people in sort of 1960s Britain heard of him, that he had this capacity. I mean, he was in the States, as you said, and but as I said, that capacity to sing in many different languages, understand many different cultures. I think it's added to the guy's aura, and in a way, Frank Sinatra was pretty one-dimensional in that aspect. I mean, okay, he wasn't
writing the song.
He wasn't Italian American as well. Yeah,
I mean, it really was as a songwriter that he stood out. I mean, he had a lovely voice. It was wonderful to hear him sing, but his songs, the writing of the songs was fantastic, and that's also one of the ways that he attached himself to other performers and they to him. When I first heard him, I was in my early teens, and he was singing along with Liza Minnelli. That was a big album for him.
He wrote for our big fado singer in Portugal, Amália Rodrigues, and they meet in Cairo and Turkey and so forth, a kind of platonic love affair.
Yeah. As he said, his affair with Edith Piaf was strictly platonic, is what he said.
He used to say that, yes.
That's what he used to say.
Anyone believe it?
Anna Navarro-Pedro spelling out the contrast between the Charles Aznavour that's remembered and the reality of today. And the reality in the United States, in Washington, D.C. this Friday, is confrontational. Brett Kavanaugh clearing the penultimate hurdle before becoming a Supreme Court judge, the U.S. Senate voting to limit debate on his confirmation, Donald Trump's pick on course for approval, perhaps by Sunday, after a speedy background check by the FBI in the wake of last week's sexual assault allegations before the senators and by Christine Blasey Ford 1 week ago. It's not a certainty that he'll be confirmed Christopher Dickey, but it's looking like it.
Yeah, it's looking very close. It might even be a tie that has to be broken by Vice President Mike Spence. But the game is pretty much over. It doesn't look like there's really any way that you could stop him now. Jeff Flake, who looked like he might have been, Senator Jeff Flake, who's not up for re-election, looked like he might have been a holdout. Now he said he's going to vote for Kavanaugh. So it looks like pretty much a done deal. And frankly, while I was covering every minute of this and watching every minute of this, not just for my writing, but because I was glued to it in days past, I wasn't watching it at all today. I think it's time to move on from this. And that's a big issue, actually, politically in the States, because the Republicans now feel that the Democrats have overplayed their hand.
Yeah, we had the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee on the floor of the Senate accusing the Democrats of inciting mob rule.
Yeah, well, that's a bit much. But they just generally, that's playing to the idea that the Democrats have pushed it too far. That Brett Kavanaugh is a victim after that kind of snivelly, whining presentation that he gave after Christine Blasey Ford. And because of the rigged FBI investigation, didn't turn up anything that substantiated what Ford had said, apparently. There's this sense, let's move on. And I think, frankly, the Democrats would be wise to move on.
Anna Navarro-Pedro, today marks the first anniversary of the Me Too movement. And what's your feeling on this? Because the argument we thought would be an argument on the issue of how you treat women, but it's turning into more of a partisan issue.
There's a backlash, for sure. And I think they will move on in the United States, for sure, with this domination. But I think in the streets, there will be more confrontation, because I don't think women are going to step back. We've seen them demonstrating in the Senate, in the Congress. And I think there will be more confrontation ahead. And the problem is, I was watching very closely American media networks, news networks, and I could see it unfolding, this idea that all of them were on to find something against Kavanaugh. And I could see it unfolding, this idea that he was becoming the victim. And in a country where everybody now has very tribal views on politics, you don't just go ask, is the guy, the 17-year-old guy, the same as a 53 or whatever? Maybe you spend 1 second asking it, but then everybody was trying to find recent arguments to reinforce their belief in the first place and not try to find the truth.
I think it did move on, though, from the original sexual assault claim, just to the man's truthfulness. I mean, he evidently, according to his classmates at Yale, he lied on several occasions.
I have no doubt he lies, but that's not the problem.
Well, it shouldn't really be a great qualification to be a judge if you're lying on oath. I'm not so certain. I mean, everyone else is saying it's the end of it. I'm not so certain. I mean, I'm sure he may well get confirmed, sure.
Oh, he will.
But I think it's going to leave a very bad legacy. I don't think it's entirely good for the Republicans. And I think people are going to pursue this, and they're going to pursue this individual because he's become, just like Weinstein and the rest of them, he's become this sort of icon of a negative icon of the Me Too movement.
But I think it's frightening how polarised the United States has become, and both camps do have strong arguments. There is a strong argument for saying somebody's nomination for something can't simply be derailed because somebody pops up, and if there's no background evidence, that's a worrying development. Equally, is someone who could be highly unsuitable about to be put in a position where he will be for life in a very, very important position. They're both strong arguments. They're both strong camps. And I think it's a mistake to assume that all women are on the side of Christine Blasey Ford.
Although most
Some of
are,
these
according
Republican
to the polls.
women. Well, I've seen stuff where people are saying that could be my son, that could be my husband in his youth. You know, it's a bit more messy.
Yeah, latest polls show Kavanaugh's disapproval rating continues to rise. But one survey by Marist College for PBS and NPR radio shows a Republican base that's been energized by the hearings. We can look at those numbers there, and we see that the number of Republican, particularly men, who are energized and will decide to vote in midterm elections, is on the increase.
Sure. Right. I mean, that's not surprising, but they're not a majority of the voters. The question is, are they just going to be so energized that they're going to go out and vote in much greater numbers than the Democrats or the women who resent this, all the people, the supposed blue wave that may come out? I don't believe in the blue wave.
But it tells us two things about the process as well. I think one of which is this, and I believe it was the Democrats, correct me if I'm wrong, that decided that you could you could approve candidates for the Supreme Court on a simple majority rather than 60%.
The Republicans did that.
Oh, the Republicans did that. Well,
that was Gorsuch.
Maybe we know. So that's a negative. But also, the Senate is absolutely out of kilter with the demographics of the U.S. I mean, every state gets 2 senators regardless.
Yeah,
and I think the argument against that is getting stronger and stronger. I know it's not going to be done in a week.
I think what the Democrats need to do is go out to their constituents and people who are sitting on the fence and say, look, we can talk about this as a Me Too issue. We can talk about performances on TV. But the real question here is the control of the United States and the U.S. government. If Trump has the Supreme Court, has this supine Congress, and he's got the executive, he can do literally anything he wants to do.
Yeah,
and what he wants to do is hugely dangerous to a vast majority of Americans in countless different ways. But we keep talking about the theater here. It's the substance that's the problem. And if the Democrats will focus on that, then they should be able to energize their base pretty effectively.
And the problem as well is, you remember laughter at United Nations General Assembly when President Trump was stating, America, we did the biggest, the best things ever. And that laughter is proof of not recognizing legitimacy anymore to the actions of Donald Trump, to the White House, this White House. The problem is as well now, where is the Senate, the FBI, the Supreme Court? These are institutions that are also devalued now after this process. So it's the whole institutional system in the United States that is shaking in its foundations.
Well, that's why these are the most important midterm elections we've ever had.
Absolutely. For many people, as you say, it seems to come down to how can I get rid of Donald Trump for X, Y, Z reasons? We need a majority in the Senate. I need to. But I just want to...
It's not a question of getting rid of him. It's just a question of
for many
having
voters,
some checks and balances.
I've seen many people say, for me, it's as simple as that. It's not even about Kavanaugh. It's as simple as that. I would like to point out, though...
Yet Americans don't go and vote. The last time more than half the population voted in the United States for a midterm election is 1914.
Wow.
And it's increasingly more difficult to, how do you call it in English? Gerrymandering.
Yeah.
So cutting out all the process of voting in such a way that it's even more difficult for every
But that's why it's so important, because in 2010, there wasn't a high turnout, but it was extremely effective for the Republicans. They took back control of the country, more or less, 2 years after Obama got elected. I mean, amazing.
And traditionally, midterms are bad for the incumbent president, so...
So it's going to be a big... But you don't think they're going to get the Senate? The Democrats stand a chance. People think they might get the House.
Well, they might. They might. It would be good for the country if they did, because there would be some checks and balances. The point is there are going to be no checks and balances if they don't at least take the House.
Yeah.
And if they do take the Senate, then there will be
All right, Christopher Dickey trying to discourage us from talking about the theater of it, but there was this tweet by Donald Trump earlier where he said that the protests were, quote, paid for Soros and by others. An allusion to George Soros. Angela Diffley.
He is presiding over a country which is immensely divided and at every opportunity pours petrol onto the fire. It's for that reason alone, there are so many people who want to get rid of him. Day after day, it's more and more shocking. His comments about Christine Blasey Ford the other day when he mocked her in public. It was awful to listen to. That said, I do think we need to... point out that the climate has changed very significantly. Back when Bill Clinton was accused of sexual assault, the line from the Democrats was, this is all the Bible Belt who are obsessed with sex. Oh, what does it matter? Social attitudes have changed gigantically, and internet has changed everything.
There could be a backlash, is what you're saying.
All of this is happening at a moment when the sounds...
And we shall know the first week of November when those midterm elections happen. When we come back in the World This Week, we're going to be taking a look at cyber spying, a case where you might call it China 1, Russia 0. Stay with us. Welcome back. Before we resume the World This Week, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. Penultimate hurdle cleared for Donald Trump's Supreme Court pick, despite protests. Brett Kavanaugh tipped for approval by the full Senate on Saturday. The Nobel Peace Prize shared between Nadia Murad, a Yazidi survivor of sexual slavery in Iraq, and Denis Mukwege, a Congolese doctor who treats war rape victims. The head of Interpol reportedly under arrest in his native China. Meng Hongwei missing since he flew home last week from the agency's headquarters in Lyon, France. A national tribute in the French capital for Charles Aznavour, the legendary singer-songwriter later laid to rest outside Paris. The French Sinatra, as some called him, died this week at 94. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Christopher Dickey, foreign editor of said Daily Beast, is with us, as is Ana Navarro Pedro, Paris correspondent for Visão, the Portuguese news weekly magazine. With us as well, Angela Diffley of Radio France International's English language service, and Patrick Smith of the Africa Report. Your next cover story?
The next cover is going to be all about Congo. and Joseph Kabila's reluctance to quit the stage.
All right, he says he is. We'll see if it happens, right?
Yes.
All right, it's
Hopefully
time.
he is.
It's time now for our Brexit Watch segment, which this week included a carefully staged exercise in self-deprecation.
Oh, God.
In a nod to the moves she displayed on a recent tour of Africa, Conservative Party leader Theresa May making her grand entrance to this year's party conference in Birmingham, a conference that concluded 2 weeks before a crucial EU summit, Patrick Smith. What do you think of those moves?
I think her moves are probably better than her policies. I think it's a tough rivalry, really. I think we're heading to two equally unacceptable scenarios. One of which is the no-deal Brexit, and the other is the failure of the negotiations and a second referendum. So both sides, the hardliners on both sides, have got these sort of fantasies that this is going to happen. That the Johnson people who are criticised, Boris Johnson, the former foreign minister who quit about 2 months ago, he's been criticising Theresa May's compromise, so he's hoping for a complete crash, and Britain's just going to get out of the EU without any deal, any negotiations. It's going to be sort of like a European Singapore with worse labour conditions and lower wages, presumably, and can make huge amounts of money for Boris and his pals. Or there's the Remainers who desperately want another referendum because they look at the polls, and most polls say that there is a bit of buyer's remorse, and that a lot of Brits are looking at the scenario of Brexit and are getting very, very worried. So it's about sort of 51, 52% at the moment want to stay in the European Union, think it was all a big mistake. Another 20% say, well, we don't mind leaving as long as it doesn't do any damage to our standard of living, which of course it will. My take on this is simply that Theresa May's checkers is what they now call Brino, which is Brexit in name only. It's essentially, it's a momentous act of self-harm. Britain leaves the EU, but essentially stays like a sort of slightly poorer Norway on very, very similar conditions. And you wait till the sort of the current wave of xenophobia finishes in the country and a new generation of Europhiles apply to rejoin the organisation 20 years from now.
Angela Diffley?
I agree with you about the Brino. For what it's worth, Theresa May, that really worked for me, her singing.
Are we underestimating her? Because with the self-deprecation and everything, she did stare down at least for one weekend or a few days. She did stare down her dissenters.
Yeah, I think
party.
she won this week, and I think that the Dancing Queen thing was inspired. I don't know whose idea it was. It's not a crime to be an awkward, useless, inhibited dancer. She laughed at herself in doing it. She really endeared herself, I think, to lots of women of my age, certainly. And I think it was probably a good thing to do. Boris Johnson is wearing thin now, the jovial, and as we see so many things now in a male-female prism, I think there's an edge of that's enough of this domineering Boris Johnson thing. She will quietly pursue her thing. As to the deal that might be secured, I think probably it will be Brino. I think it will be checkers. I don't think it will be no deal because somebody will blink first, probably Britain, and the scenario is too awful. And if there is a no deal, there will have to be a hard border in Northern Ireland. And since that is the enormous sticking point, to finish off with no deal, which would leave us back where we started,
you can't get a no deal through the Parliament, and that's the arithmetic she faces.
They would send her back, or send
so they send
whoever
it
was Prime
back,
Minister
which will
back to
be
renegotiate.
an even worse sort of checkers-type deal, where the 27 will be in total control. And they say, well, we'll give you what we were offering before, and so...
Yeah.
That's
There's
why
an
you get the
emerging
Brino.
idea now, apparently, which has the backing of Dublin, whereby Britain, all of Britain and Northern Ireland, including Northern Ireland, would stay in a customs union temporarily with no end date until something better had been arranged. That pleases the Northern Irish, who do not want to be left in the customs union by themselves and in that way separated from Britain. So that might work, but the European Union isn't happy with that. So we'll find out in 10 days.
In 10 days' time, it's all coming to a head. Time now for a segment you could call Welcome to the Marriott. The hotel chain in the news this week. Its branch in The Hague, adjacent to the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog's headquarters. Dutch authorities revealing that back on April 13th, they caught 4 Russian agents red-handed trying to crack into the OCPWA's Wi-Fi network. But to hear the manager tell it, spy stories ain't what they used to be.
Unfortunately, no Aston Martins, no revolving number plates, nobody skydiving from the rooftop. It's a very dull James Bond story. Coincidentally, the guest they want to talk to came into the lobby out of the elevator, and they approached the guest and said, "Would you please follow us?" And that's what happened. And they followed the police outside, and they never returned.
Chris Radicki, that's no fun.
That was very realistic. I mean, that's exactly the way it was. And these guys seem to have been particularly inept. I mean, it looks like they probably were known even before they landed and were watched pretty closely all along. But everything we've seen about their operation looks like it's like high school level spying. It's really, really inept stuff. And we see that again and again with the Russians. I mean, it's one thing, and we've talked about this before, it's one thing for them to want to leave evidence, to let you know that I am doing this and you can't do anything about it. It's another thing to be incompetent, and these guys just looked incompetent.
Let's just remember something. Of course, apparently they were caught just by a simple Google research from their cars and their, Instagram, kind of Instagram or stuff like that. But just some time ago, remember that Russia and China got a lot of data on CIA because they got it through. All the agents were wearing those very fashionable, connected
fitness trackers.
Fitness trackers and connected
watches.
Wrist watches and stuff. Yeah, right, sorry. And apparently they got a lot of information about their whereabouts, what they were doing, and everything about them. So CIA had to put a stop to it, but after a while.
This cartoon from Matt in the Daily Telegraph. We're tourists from Moscow. We've come to see your spectacular mountains. That, of course, an allusion, Angela Diffley, to the fact that those 2 agents claimed that they were going to Salisbury to see the beautiful cathedral, not to poison the Skripals.
Yeah, they should have found a better story, I think. It didn't
So what's going on? Is it? I mean, we were saying when that happened, oh yeah, the Russians are leaving their calling cards. Some were saying, and I mean, after that, it seems a little inept.
It's pretty inept, yes.
This doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the narrative we've been spun for the last couple of years about the all-powerful Vladimir Putin himself from a spy agency and who knows what he's doing all the time when it comes to intrigue and sleuth.
No, it absolutely doesn't, and. Yes.
But, I mean, when you spoke this week calling Skripal a scumbag, I think, the whole personal animus came out here. And I thought, you mentioned about the sort of China 1, Russia 0 thing. I mean, a lot of these Russian operations appear to be based on this. It's some sort of grudge or animus, whether it's against Hillary Clinton or Skripal or something like that. The Chinese espionage that I've been looking at ahead of this program, it looks a lot more functional. It looks a lot more targeted. We need to know this information. This is how we're going to get it.
But they can do it because they make stuff.
They make stuff, yeah. And as the Apple guys are saying,
they can put things in computers. Russians.
Let's talk about that. No one's calling the Chinese amateurish, as Patrick Smith points out, not after Bloomberg Businessweek published its 3-year investigation into the tiniest of microchips inserted by the Chinese into products shipped to the U.S. with, according to Bloomberg, More than 24 companies, including a major bank, government contractors, Apple, Amazon, all infected. You have to look very closely indeed to find it, as illustrated by this picture in the piece. That's the size of a penny. Next to it, the size of that microchip. Anna Navarro-Petro.
But again, in the early 2000s, what's new under the sun? In the early 2000s, I think it was the Minister of Justice, but I might be wrong, but I'm just pulling this out of my memory right now. They had all their computers renewed and replaced, and it was an Israeli firm who got that market. And they found out that all the computers had spying devices as well, and it was the good friend Israel. So it's absolutely nothing new. What I think the problem here is for the United States, who is also spying on all of us, of course, in Europe and elsewhere, isn't it? The interesting thing is the state of mind in public agencies and government is all set for Russia, and they apparently have been neglecting China's push into the United States, and they seem to be waking up now.
I don't think that that they've been neglecting. I don't think that the U.S. services have been neglecting China at all. I think that's one of the reasons that we see this story. It came out of an investigation, and there are investigations all the time. There are Chinese spies being arrested all the time. They don't make the publicity that the Russians do because the Russians are so much more flamboyant. They're out murdering people, and they're out trying to transform the political system or undermine the political system of the United States, notwithstanding.
And that's what China
Although we did have that accusation
now.
this week by the U.S. Vice President
Trump
saying that the Chinese are trying to meddle in the midterms.
Well, that's because he wants to take the heat off the Russians. I mean,
and FBI has just said recently that China has got $8 billion this year to invest into actions within the United States and 68 other countries in order to curtail American influence in those countries.
Sure,
so
well, fine. That's the game. And $8 billion in the great shape of things is not a huge budget, I have to say. But
if you are resting on the network of Chinese.
But I don't think anybody's ignoring China. I do think that the Russians are a different kind of kettle of fish. China is the second richest country in the world. It's a huge power. Russia's not. Russia is all about trying to project its power. It's got an insignificant economy. Its
so are you saying
like
that China's is more important than Russia, or the opposite?
I'm saying that China, what I'm getting to is that Putin is trying to punch way above his weight, and he is using the kinds of things that we discuss all the time, some of them effective, some not, to punch above his weight. That's why he was so interested in interfering with the American elections. The place that we really need to look to see how Putin has manipulated the situation is Syria. He is the go-to guy in Syria, a very complicated thing. He used it to project Russian power, to project Russian diplomacy, and to project Russian espionage. There's a great saying in Syria these days that he must be a Sunni Muslim because he's got 4 wives. He's got Israel, he's got Saudi Arabia, he's got Turkey, and and he's got Iran. And so these are the 4 countries that he manipulates and that come to him, whereas the United States is busy cutting itself off from Iran, cutting itself off from Turkey. So I think that's what you have to look at, is Putin projecting power.
And Chris Radicki, the denial, despite, this is what Apple said in its statement, despite numerous discussions across multiple teams and organizations, no one at Apple has ever heard of the investigation into the Chinese putting those little tiny microchips into their products.
It's the mother of all denials. I read it this morning, the Apple denial. And when you read the story, it's a fascinating story because there are absolutely categorical denials by every single company that is mentioned in the story. Amazon, Apple, all of them, and the key, the motherboard company that is at the heart of it, all of them, no problem, nothing happened. And yet, clearly Bloomberg had sources multiple sources that enabled them to tell this
It'd be
story.
interesting if they changed their computer hardware and software as a result of this.
Well,
those companies.
according to
Yeah.
Bloomberg, several companies
that's what
did.
they've been doing.
Yeah.
That's what Amazon did.
Yeah.
Has Apple done the same?
Well, they don't admit there was ever a problem.
All right. And it gets us back to the point that you made, which is that China produces 75% of the world's mobile phones and 90% of its PCs now.
It would be very tempting to spy on people, wouldn't it, if you did that?
It would be very silly not to do it in a
Indeed.
world where we live in. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Yeah,
you're such a
increasing
cynic.
competition.
That's the way things go.
All right. And speaking of which, there is this weird twist that's come to us this Friday with the Chinese president of the International Law Enforcement Agency, Interpol, Meng Hongwei. He has been reported missing to French police by his wife under investigation in China. A source told the South China Morning Post. Ditto with a French source speaking to Le Monde. Anna Navarro-Pedro, what do you make of this story?
Each time I think nothing else is going to surprise me anymore in this world, there is something that makes my jaw drop. It's astounding, this, and it makes a lot. It raises a lot of questions. How did the former minister, a Communist Party member at that high level, become the head of Interpol? It's just amazing.
And how come none of us knew?
Well,
It's
and
not
the
widely
security
known.
minister who was responsible, still holds the portfolio, is responsible for lots of human rights abuses in China. That he would have that position is interesting. But
It's,
as
yes,
our
and-
article points out on this, people disappear in China all the time. Billionaires, members of the government,
Actors,
Movie stars.
actors.
movie stars, they disappear,
especially
and then
the
weirdly they reappear some weeks or months later, usually with big advertisements in newspapers and articles.
Lots of contrition.
Saying I figured it all out now.
Yeah. Well, the week, by the way, is not over. There's going to be lots of elections. Bosnia, this Sunday, we'll know if Brazilians are ready to vote for their answer to Donald Trump. And in Cameroon, it's 85-year-old Paul Biya vying for his seventh term in office, despite outcry over mismanagement, the whole-scale crackdown on an insurgency in the Anglophone west of the country. The leader of 35 years seems pretty confident of winning that seventh term. Biya's first campaign appearance came just last Sunday in the northern city of Marois, just 1 week before the poll, Patrick Smith. What do you make of Paul Biya's longevity?
Yonder is answer to Donald Trump. He's the oldest serving African leader now. He's 84. 85. And so he'll be 92 when he finishes this next term. It's astonishing because it's a wonderful country in terms of the human capital in the place, the skilled architects, engineers, journalists, writers, lawyers. Most of them are here. Many of them are here in Paris. And the economy has just been treading water for the past 20, 30 years, and it's getting tougher. What a lot of people were hoping for, in a perverse way, I guess, is that this rebellion in the Anglophone regions would give people pause in these elections, and that Biya just wouldn't be able to rig his way through. But the reality is most people think he's headed for another election win. It won't be like the 78% he got in 2011. It's going to be quite a bit narrower. And of course, there will be no election effectively in many of the Anglophone areas because the security situation is so bad there. But already 200,000 Anglophone Cameroonians have fled over the border to Nigeria.
Nigeria, where you were recently. What do Nigerians make of all this?
Well, I asked the government about it, and they said, well, we need Biya's government to help us with the Islamist militia, Boko Haram, in the north. So we're not about to pick a fight with him over an internal matter. We just told him, you've got to settle this. We can't accommodate all these people flooding across the border. But there it stands. I think the other issue people were raising is, where is the West in this? What is the European Union saying about this? What is the US saying about this? I mean, you've got the seeds of a pretty nasty conflict there. It's a sort of linguistic regional conflict. It's the state has hollowed out. It's become a classic kleptocracy along the lines of Mobutu Sese Seko, with this aging guy who seems to be absolutely inviolable internationally, and there's just no censure of what he does. And it's not just a matter of the corruption and the bad government, but it's actually also the human rights abuses. You know, there have been a lot of footage circulating on social media showing random killings of men, women, and even children by the security forces in the West. It's pretty brutal. And you know, the silence on the part of the West is pretty deafening.
What might the European Union usefully do?
Well, I think they could certainly push in the UN and other agencies and start making a noise. At the moment, the Biya regime takes this silence for some sort of approbation. I mean, I think there needs to be some strong words and some waving of sticks and so on. I mean, no one's suggesting there should be an intervention or anything like that. But, you know, there's a conflict there, and things need to be done to save lives. And at the moment, the outside world is missing in action. And the rebels are in a tiny minority. And worst of all, the people caught between the rebels and the Biya regime are suffering, and it's getting worse and worse.
All right, and the situation in Cameroon is, of course, something we're going to cover on France 24. I want to thank you, Patrick Smith. I want to thank Anna Navarro, Pedro, Angela Diffley, Christopher Dickey. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Charlie James. The Nobel Prize for the Nobel Peace Prize this year shared between two emblematic figures in the fight against violence against women.
That is right, and there's been a lot of interest in them online. A lot of people also pointing out that she is the first Iraqi to win this award, so that's a lot of excitement from the Iraqi community online that she is being recognized in the Yazidi community. And another video I wanted to point out for our viewers here from Bill Gates, Heroes in the Field. Here, start this here, where they followed him around, and you really get to see his work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he has helped tens of thousands of victims.
Yeah,
there.
Denis Mukwege was operating when he got the news earlier today that he was the co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize.
That's right. Really adding to his amazing story, and I wanted to bring you a couple of reactions. New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof saying, "I'm thrilled that two people I have greatly admired over the years have won the Nobel Prize. A fantastic choice. Now, if only they can get what they most want, peace for Congo and the Yazidi." And one more, Sarah Lee Whitson from Human Rights Watch, saying, "Nobel Peace Prize to heroes fighting sexual abuse of women is a shout out to the millions of Me Too survivors. It's also the year one anniversary of the Me Too movement being launched into the public eye by the New York Times investigation into Harvey Weinstein." So a little bit of overlapping of big stories there.
Overlapping of big stories. Let's change gears here for a second with the story of an 8-year-old girl.
That's right, in Sweden. So this is an incredible story. Her name is Saga, and she pulled which is just perfect, she pulled a 1,500-year-old Viking-era sword, this is her, from a lake in southern Sweden. She was on vacation with her family there. Her father posted about this on Facebook, along with pictures of her there with the sword on vacation. She had been skipping stones in the lake, which had receded a little bit more than usual because of a drought.
It was a hot summer in Sweden. There were forest fires.
And so she was able to access parts that normally she wouldn't be able to. Felt something on the ground, pulls it out. Her father said she pulled it over her head and said, "Daddy, I found a sword." Archaeologists were on the scene the next day. They confirmed that it is, in fact, a Viking-era sword, and actually found a brooch also, a brooch in the lake from the same period. So with the echoes of the Sword in the Stone legend and Lady of the Lake legend, locals have been nicknaming her Queen of Sweden.
Okay.
This journalist...
Careful, there's already was one, I believe.
This journalist for the National Public Broadcasting station saying, "Finally an end to our post-election limbo. Tell the political parties someone else has been chosen by fate to form the government."
Okay, we'll leave it there. I want to thank you so much, Charlie James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.